Welcome. My name is Kshitij Kapoor, and this is episode 5 of Life Beyond Coronavirus, The Expert View. Now, Australia has weathered the first wave of this pandemic, but it has come at a big economic cost, with much of that impact yet to be felt. And as Australians return to work, we ask, how many will return to work? What are the challenges that business leaders face? If it is so difficult to reopen large office buildings, is working from home the new norm? And if working from home is the new norm, how do we deal with the fact that women have been disproportionately affected by the lockdown? To discuss this and other topics, I'm joined by 4 world-leading experts from across the University of Melbourne. Professor Jeff Borland is a labour economist and the Truby Williams Professor of Economics. Professor Jane Gunn is a general practitioner and the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences. Associate Professor Leah Ruppanner is a sociologist and the co-director of the Policy Lab. And Associate Professor Jen Overbeck is a psychologist and an expert in organisations at the Melbourne Business School. So, Jeff, Australia's entered into its first recession in 29 years. What is going to happen in the next 12 months?
Well, Kshitij, there's many scenarios you could imagine over the next 12 months, but if we want to be optimistic and take a best case scenario, I think it's possible to think that in 12 months' time we will have recovered the majority of employment losses that we've seen so far due to COVID-19. But I think even under best case scenario, we'll still be some way away from where we were in March before this event started.
Well, Jeff, you hold on to your optimism. I want to come back to that. But Jane, do you think it is safe for people to be returning to the office or factory in large numbers?
I think it's not safe for people to return in large numbers all at once. But I think that it is very safe for people to start returning to offices.
Well, we'll learn more about that, Leah. Many of us have been working from home for some time now. Have there been some clear winners and losers in this working from home business?
I'm going to say no. I think everyone has kind of lost as a result of this.
Well, thank you. That was a simple answer, but a troubling one. So I'm coming back to that. Jen, the workplace may never be the same. What is the most important thing that managers must know?
I think there are 3 primary things managers need to be keeping in mind during this time: how to lead effectively, how to connect both themselves and people who work with them and for them, and then how to avoid the biases and habits that could get in the way and derail effectiveness.
All right, well, look, we'll come and study all of those things. But Jeff, let me start with you. Now, a lot of people focus on the total number of jobs and unemployment percent, but you actually track the hours people work. Tell us why that's important.
Well, in Australia it's particularly important because we've had the JobKeeper scheme introduced as a response to COVID-19, and the JobKeeper scheme means that a lot of people who would otherwise have been classified as unemployed in fact are classified in the Australian Bureau of Statistics figures as employed. So the best way to track what's happening in the Australian labour market is to look at what's happening to actual hours worked.
And what's happening there?
Well, what we know is that the most recent data tell us what happened between mid-March and mid-April. And yeah, we saw a decrease in hours worked, a speed and a scale that we've never seen before in Australia's history. Basically, 9% hours worked reduced by in that period. And just to benchmark that, we had recessions in Australia in the 1980s and 1990s. In those recessions, after 18 months, we got down to hours lost of about 6%. So basically in 1 month, we've gone way past the troughs of those recessions.
Now this is despite the fact that the government puts in this massive program called JobKeepers to protect jobs, and that's going to be ending soon. So what is going to happen once JobKeepers ends?
Well, I think it all depends on the way in which JobKeeper ends. I think when you look at the outlook for employment at the moment through to the end of September, when JobKeeper is planned to finish, you would expect that if JobKeeper just finishes, there'll be a mass transfer of people from employment, from receiving JobKeeper onto unemployment. And that's why a lot of economists are arguing that we really need continued stimulus after September, and we need there to be a transition from JobKeeper rather than just stopping it in an instant. We need a way to phase it out.
So, all right, so we hope the transition comes, but whether JobKeeper transitions or not, people are transitioning back to work. And Jane, what will the office look like as people get back to work?
Well, I think the office is going to look similar and familiar in many ways, but very different in others. And one of the things about the office that's going to be challenging is us maintaining the physical distancing that's been one of the key control measures for COVID-19. And also the way that we interact with each other, whether we have face-to-face meetings, whether we go and grab a coffee together, how close we sit with each other. There's a thing about physical distancing that I think is going to make the office a different place and quite peculiar.
I mean, I can share with our listeners that as we walked in today in these ABC offices, I had to answer questions on the intercom, and then they sent someone to take my temperature. Then I had to clean my hands with a sanitizer. Then I had to fill out a form and sign it twice. I don't know why I had to sign it twice, but the same form I had to sign in 2 different places. Is this what's going to be how we come to work every day?
I think for some offices that will be the case for a while, but I think picking up on what Jeff said around not doing things suddenly, or the fact that we need to phase transitions back to work means that whilst we might be filling out many forms and doing lots of checks when we start to come back to the office, as we get more comfort and we see that we have maintained control of COVID-19, those things will gradually relax. It won't just suddenly return to normal. It will be, I think, a slow transition back to what's very familiar.
Now, Jim, I understand all of these, restrictions. At face value, they make sense. Mm-hmm. But what's the science behind this? And let me tell you why I ask. The WHO says we need 1 meter distance. Mm-hmm. In Australia, we say 1.5. In London, they say 2. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a 200% variation based on science. What kind of science is this?
Yes. Well, look, I think the science behind social distancing has really generated an enormous amount of attention over the last 3 months. And also, there's been just furious work around the world to really understand the science behind that. So we've seen people looking at trying to put all the evidence together about exactly what you say. Is it 1 metre, 2 metres, 3 metres? Look, the simple answer to that is that a very, very thorough systematic review, which was published in The Lancet a couple of weeks ago, has shown that pretty unequivocally there is a relationship between keeping away from people and not catching a virus. And no surprise, the further you are away, the less likely you are to catch the virus. I think the thing with COVID-19 that's rather makes this physical distancing important is that it's spread just when people are talking or speaking or whatever, and they may be asymptomatic. And this is why it's a particularly contagious virus, and that's this physical distancing. 2 metres is probably better than 1.5, and 3 is probably better than 2. But anything more than 1 is a dramatic improvement or reduction in risk. And that's why you'll see different countries have settled on different numbers, 6 feet, 1.5 metres, 2 metres. They're all better than 1, or larger than 1, and that's the important cut-off, the 1 metre cut-off.
No, but you see, one of the things this will do is that if we have to keep these distances in offices, the offices will accommodate less people. Mm. So a lot of us may have to continue working from home. Now, Leah, you said there were no winners from working from home. Are there losers?
Yeah, definitively there are losers. So one of the challenges with working from home was that immediately overnight the kids came home, right? Schools closed, daycares closed, and all of that work came into the home. The question is, who picked up the work, right? So we actually conducted a study. We were interested in this because the expectation is that women picked up the work. and they picked it up disproportionately to men. So we can have our ideas of what we think happens, but it's pretty essential to bring evidence and data, right, to support this. So we conducted a study with the U.S. Study Center, La Trobe, and the Policy Lab at the University of Melbourne, and we looked to see who's doing what in the home at this period of time. What we found was that women are picking up much more of the housework. Men are doing more, but women are doing significantly more. They're picking up much more of the homeschooling. The New York Times ran a piece showing from colleagues in the US that women are taking 80% of that work. And the challenge is, as everyone has their kids home, what happens to your work? This is a question about equity, equality, and quality of work, right? I saw this amazing tweet that said, who's sitting at the kitchen table and who's sitting in the office? And if women are sitting at the kitchen table doing their work, this is an open space, whose work is being protected at this moment in time? The reason I say there are no winners is because, I mean, I think about my kid, right? She's having the time of her life out of school, eating snacks, hanging out, watching YouTube. But the challenge is, this is actually bad for the quality of learning, so it's not good for kids. This is widening class-based gaps about access of who has and who doesn't. If this is a shecession, which we can talk about, Jeff, I'd like your opinion on this. And we know that women aren't going to be re-entering the labor market because their industries are being wiped out, not just slow to open, but potentially gone.
What do you mean women's industries are being wiped out?
So what I mean is that whereas the recession in the previous recession, the global financial crisis, came for construction, right? It came for manufacturing. This one, you see what's closing are tourism, service industry, the restaurants, right? And these are disproportionately worked by women. Women enter these occupations. I'm not talking about the nurses. I'm not talking about the teachers. We know that this is an essential work. We know that this is female-dominated work. But if women are in these occupations, tourism, service industry, and we know that this is either going to be very slow to recover, or some of these jobs are going to disappear altogether. What are these women going to do? One, and what are they going to do when they have kids at home? Are we going to just see a retreat to the home? Are they going to need to reskill? And always the key component of this for women is caregiving.
That's interesting. So what's this shecession? Did you say the new words come up? This is a recession for women?
Well, I think Leah's made a really important point about the impact of this downturn by gender, and in fact, I think it goes further than Leah's saying. So it is exactly as Leah said. The industry concentration of this downturn is on industries that disproportionately employ women. But from the analysis we've been able to do so far, even when you look within industries, women are being disproportionately adversely affected than men. So even when you control for this industry mix, women are more likely to be the ones who are doing the what we're calling 0 hours work now, having their hours reduced to zero and really only being counted as employed because of the JobKeeper. Women much more likely to have moved out of the labour force as well. So I think this is a major policy issue that when the government gets to its next stage of stimulus and thinks about employment creation, they really need to be thinking about policies that disproportionately improve job opportunities for women.
Right. I read an interesting article which said that this incident has an interesting effect. Some of us have gone back to the 1930s, and some of us have gone forward to the 2030s. So, for some of us, life has become entirely electronic, tele, I and E, and for some of us, it's gone back, to go back at home, no work, take care of the kids. Now, what does that do to productivity? The nations are always preoccupied with how productive we are, this GDP business.
Yeah.
What's it doing to our productivity?
Well, the macro question about productivity should be directed to Jeff as the economist. But at a micro level, if we think about individuals and their productivity, I think there are a few things. First, with regard to work from home and the notion that there have been no winners, I think it's important to remember that during COVID, it has not just been work from home. It's been school from home. It's been cafe from home. It's been daycare from home. It's been gym from home. Everything has been taking place in the home. And that's a lot of burden to put on the home. I think what we're hearing from managers at the business school is that they've been pleasantly surprised, even astonished at how well people have done, that workers have risen to the occasion, that they've shown an agility and a nimbleness that they didn't show before, that kind of crisis mode really brought out a lot of energy and a lot of effort, and I think carried those businesses that were able to maintain employment through the early phases, I think, in a rewarding way. I think the risk right now is that people are getting very tired. They're getting fatigued with the experience of being in quarantine and having to juggle all of these things. I think you can really see the longing to get back to normal, but we know, as Jane just said, that normal isn't going to look like normal for quite a while. So I think right now we're at a bit of an inflection point, and I think there are some things that are really positive. For example, work from home might actually be work from home. I don't think we've had an opportunity yet to see how it works. I don't think that this is a good test for Australian businesses of whether working from home is a viable option in the future, because so many things have been thrown into the mix and confounded with the working.
But Jen, the world isn't going to stop to allow us to do a test. So, we can't do randomized trials.
No, life lets us do a test.
Yeah, life won't. So how do you think this is going to play out?
So I think what we're going to see is children are going to start going back to school. That's already begun. I got an email yesterday from my gym saying it's opening on the 22nd of June. I won't be there yet, but many people will. And so we'll be able to start moving some activities outside the house. But I don't think there's nothing magical. And you're right, we're not going to stop and do a test. The point is that life should facilitate a bit better balance, but that's not going to happen unless we're very intentional about it. We were thrown into COVID and we had to react. The way we come out of COVID, I think, has to be guided by a greater sense of planning and perspective and intention if we want to land softly.
So tell me how this would be managed, in the sense, let's say some of the people get back to work, some of the people don't. So now you're having a meeting in your office and there's 3 people here, or, one is on Zoom, one is on Skype, the other one's on Team, the other one's on the phone. What does this do to the sense of team cohesion, team building?
I mean, it definitely poses challenges. What we know from the research on remote work, and we've got really decades at this point of research, the chief obstacle to success with remote work is the feeling of disconnection between people. So, there's a lot of concern about not being in the corridors and not encountering people casually, and some of the ideas and decisions that get generated during those times, and that is a loss. But the main loss is the sense of just relatedness and connection and engagement that people feel. And when you have people who are present in different modes, it's harder to create a sense of immediacy and a sense of connection. And I think what that does is it changes the roles of managers and leaders, that part of their job becomes less about monitoring and surveilling, looking over your shoulder to make sure you're doing your work, and more about sitting back and thinking about, how do I engineer opportunities for people to connect? How do I keep top of mind who all the people are? So one concern that's been expressed as we transition back to work is not just women, but racial minorities, ethnic minorities, who already in the workplace tended to be sort of less visible and less top of mind for employers. And so now you put people on the other side of a video connection. Exactly. And it might be just easier to forget and overlook certain members of the team. So
we'll come back to that. Important, of course, all of us realize there's George Floyd and Black Lives Matters, and I think that's another overlay to this, which may impact the way we come out of it. But before I get there, as I'm working this through in my mind, one of the striking features of the world's big cities used to be their CBD. It used to be this density of offices, be that Midtown Manhattan, may it be the city in London, the CBD here in Melbourne. Will there still be a CBD, Jeff? Will people need to come into these very dense concentrations, packed in subways, or is that now something of the past?
No, I think there'll definitely be CBD still. I think, as Jane said, I think the extent to which people come back to the CBD, is obviously it's going to be a transition back. But I think, Yeah, the drivers sort of towards people congregating in CBDs and large urban areas are they haven't gone away.
Okay. So you're saying don't sell your stock in the CBD, but Jane, help me. If that office can now, allow only for half the occupants, and then standing in lifts becomes very delayed, and you've got to make lines outside, how will this work for?
Well, I think we've been covering a lot of the ways it will work in the conversation because I think we're probably going to see the end of this very strict working day for many people in the CBD, for example, and that one of the things that has happened throughout, we've tested very suddenly, people can work more flexibly, and it's been remarkable that people have been able to, around about mid-March, suddenly leave the office overnight and really keep working, if they've managed to maintain employment, let me add, without missing a beat. Now, I think this has probably challenged some managers' mindsets who like to have everyone right there so they can see what they're doing and they can keep an eye on things, and that gives them a sense that something's happening. Whereas I think they've realised that things continue to happen even when people are dispersed, and that this hopefully will give more flexibility to the workplace.
Now that's flexibility for those who do cognitive work. There is, of course, a lot of people who work with their hands,
Yes.
construction, meat packing,
Sure.
Assembly lines.
Well, they've kept working, haven't they? And I think that's remarkable too, that all those people in factories and bringing us essential services have continued to go to work every day. But I think we need to remember that part of the reason that they've been able to continue to go to work every day is that the people that do the office-based work, which is a large proportion of society, have stayed at home. So that means that, when they've travelled on public transport, when they've gone about their business, they've been able to do that safely, much more safely than if we had all said, I must sit in my office and I refuse to leave. I'm going to stay here because my job's important. It has meant that for those of us who can work from home, we've done that, and that's been one of the key ways that we've brought
So that's
COVID
an interesting thing. So you're saying that in some sense the office workers staying at home has made it safer for those who had to go to their factories.
Absolutely, absolutely safer. And I think we need to be mindful of that as we transition back to the face-to-face things, that whilst we all want to do that, I think we have to prioritise who gets first dibs on doing that. And that has to be done sensibly. In each work environment, it will be a different priority list, and those things will start to happen. And some of us who used to maybe be on the top of the pecking order and like to be in our office have to be at the bottom. And this is
Well, it's very interesting at our university. Our Vice-Chancellor, you'd think he'd be the one who'd have the biggest office and be there first. Well, he's chosen to work from home so that the others who are in some sense more essential to be physically present in their labs can get there. But let me ask you what this means for managers. The traditional sort of Charles Dickens view of the manager was a person going around looking, making sure you were there. Then we came to this more evolved, I would say, late 20th century manager who was trying to cheer up their team. But now you're neither monitoring nor physically present to cheer up your team and do team building. What does the manager do? They just look at Excel sheets.
Interesting you say that. For quite a while now, in business schools, we have been looking at the rapid state of change, constant change in the world, and thinking about how managers need to cope with that. And really an adaptive style of management and leadership seems to be the way to go. It's improvisational, it's setting plans and yet being responsive to the current moment. And I guess the metaphor that I like best to think about this is that the manager these days is like the conductor of an orchestra. You don't stand over the tubas and make sure that they're playing the notes right. You think about the entire piece, what it is that you're trying to achieve, and then all you do is you use your hands at a remote distance to bring up some of the volume here and ease some of the energy there, and together that facilitates, the production of something as an organization or a collective.
I like that you use the metaphor of orchestras, because there is one business that has been so greatly affected by this. First, they can't get together to play.
Yeah.
Then the rest of us can't get together to listen. So, but nonetheless,
Yeah.
I get the analogy that you need someone who's sort of a conductor in that way. But wouldn't they also need to be a conductor plus a health inspector? Because I worry that, we all used to make jokes about occupational health and safety.
Yeah.
That's going to go viral in this context. Because you could, and rightly so, you could say that there'll be an obligation of the employer to make sure everyone's maintaining 1.5, so no communal kitchens, a lift monitor who makes sure only 4 people get into the lift. This will change the office relationship. What would be the point of going to an office if you won't really be interacting with people, having lunch or chatting or things like that?
I think that you raise a very good point. I think that the role of the occupational health physician, for example, being a medical practitioner, is one that's going to re-emerge as an important occupation. Now we obviously have occupational health physicians, but probably a lot of people don't know that much about them. And I think that COVID-19 has seen the requirement for people to think really deeply about how safe and healthy our workplaces are in a way that is more akin to how we think about healthcare settings. And it's like the workplace has almost become a version of a hospital, with sanitizer and signing and all of these things. So I think that's going to really require us to work with architects and people that design our office spaces to think creatively about how you still make them engaging places to be if we're left with future-proofing us against viral pandemics like we've just had. Is it going to be worth to reshape the way that offices are built, etc.?
Yeah,
or is it all just temporary? And if we put up a few partitions in, 1 year's time, we can be back to normal.
Because, in the last 10 years, we've been making a virtue of this thing called the open plan.
Yeah.
It helped interaction, free flow of conversation. Not that everyone agreed with it, not the evidence was very good, but everyone liked open office plans. Well, what happens to open offices now?
I think that's a huge challenge in one way. In another, it's probably, in terms of COVID-19, we know that the worst places to be are in poorly ventilated small environments. So actually, large, open space, open air, outside even better, is going to be potentially the new norm. So maybe it's not the end of the open plan office, but the people squashed together like a tin of sardines, that's not such a great idea. So that's why maybe the same space will be used, but we won't all sit there for the entire day all together. And maybe that's why we will need to start with more flexibility and use our space differently.
Right.
Can I make a comment on this notion too of the managers as potentially needing to guard people's behavior? And I feel a little strange saying this to prominent people from the medical school, but from hand washing research, we know that when physicians are told in a very monitoring and controlling way, you need to wash your hands, there's a lot of reactance and there's a lot of resistance to doing so, as much as everybody knows it's important. But when the message is capitalized on physicians' innate caring for their patients, and they emphasize the way that your hand washing is going to keep your patient safe, then that tends to amplify compliance with the behavior. And so I think as we consider how to manage workplaces, it's important to keep people's psychology in mind. If the manager is taking the role of the scold and the occupational safety and health, overseer, then people, I think, are going to, subconsciously reject that.
Right.
So it's important to think about messaging, and to think about using people's concern for their own safety and for their care for others to get their behavior to change.
So we've talked about a number of these concerns, but all of these have been in the context of Australia. And it would be fair to say that as a country, we've been doing very well. I think it was by design and luck, but we got there. But the challenge is that we're a country that interacts a lot with the world, and the world isn't doing so well. So whatever we do internally, our borders are likely to remain closed for some time for free travel, and some estimates are that might not just be weeks, it might be months, could be years, unless there is a vaccine. Now, how much of our economy, Jeff, depends on open borders?
Well, it depends on trade in our borders in a couple of ways. One way, which I think you're alluding to, Shiddish, is that there's people transfer between countries. That tourism, we're very much aware, education, but as well we're dependent on the health of the world economy through other goods that we export, goods and services that we export. So, coming back to right at the start, when you asked me what's the outlook for 12 months' time, and I said, well, look, I think we'll have made significant steps towards recovery, but we won't have got all the way there. That's one of the blockers sort of to us, really getting all the way back to where we were in March, the international situation, the fact that there are some sectors that will continue to be affected by people not being able to travel between countries, and the fact that so far, I guess, our major trading partners seem to be moving into recovery now, which is a good sign for exports of goods and services. But to the extent that sort of other countries we trade with don't recover so quickly, or it goes on for a while, that'll continue to be a drag on the economy.
But I mean, our stuff might go out, but we had a large trade of people coming in. It was largely tourism, for which Australia is rightfully famous, and education, which we were very good at. And we are here at the University of Melbourne, which benefited a lot from that and contributed a lot in that way. What are your thoughts about these sectors of the economy? I mean, New Zealand's in a similar situation. They've got a perfect situation at home. Apparently, they've got rugby matches starting all over again, yet not a single tourist coming in.
Well, those one of the really distinctive things about this episode is how it's affected particular industries and sectors, like as we talked about right at the start, accommodation and food services, retail, arts and recreation initially because of the health-related closures. I think as we unwind those health-related restrictions, exactly as you're saying, because we've got these other restrictions, sort of they're going to keep binding. So we are going to continue to see impacts on the higher education sector. We're going to continue to see impacts on those parts of accommodation and food services and tourism and aviation that relate to travel. There will continue to be negative effects there.
Airlines may never be the same again. Now, many say that the answer to all of this is we need to become self-sufficient, that Australia needs to start manufacturing again. We can't rely on these long supply chains. They're very vulnerable. Is that the answer?
No, I think it would be silly to completely turn things around based on the knowledge we have of sort of the way the world is at the moment and the way it might evolve. You learn from episodes like this, and you may decide that look, there are particular goods that we think it would be useful for us to be able to bring into production more quickly if episodes like this occur. But if the question is, should Australia go back to making
fridges,
motor cars, then I think the answer's
probably
no at the moment.
Probably no. So what should Australia then go ahead, if not going back to manufacturing? There's a lot of talk about high-tech and digital, and if you actually look at the stock markets, the stocks that have really risen are actually the high-tech companies, most of them being in the US, not that many here. So is that the future? Is that going to disproportionately benefit as a result of what has happened?
Well, it's certainly benefited a lot in the short run, and I guess stock markets sometimes have a tendency to overreact to the short run and not be that perfect at forecasting the long run. I think the nature of economic activity in developed economies has been moving away from agriculture, away from manufacturing industry towards services, and so Australia was already sort of predominantly a service economy before this, and so I think that's
even more.
That's
digital services, and Leah, you study these high-tech companies, and you know how they've been changing their ways, and some have already announced no office. Which one was it? Is it Twitter who said don't even come back till 2021?
I think Facebook is saying so. Facebook has said people don't have to come back and they can work wherever they want. They're going to adjust salaries based on where you live, so you can live anywhere in the world, and then they'll pay you less, which seems
Yes.
A bit odd, right? Like, oh, okay, I'll move to Nebraska and then I'll get paid $20,000 and whatever. Anyway, but this is not who I am. But I think one of the things to kind of piggyback, if you don't mind me dominating the conversation, to piggyback a little bit on some of the things Jane said, and then if I can ask Jeff a question.
Yes.
One of the things that I think this pandemic has done is really amplified existing inequalities, right? We had these inequalities that were happening. We had racial inequality, we had gender inequality, and what we saw was once that pandemic hit, that those inequalities became just crystal clear, right? Who are the people that are on the bus, still going to work? So we talk about now is the moment for people to step back, people with flexibility, people with autonomy, people in professional positions like us. Jane rightfully said, now's the moment for you to step aside so that everyone else can have better health. But I think there is a really important question about who are the people that are on the buses. This is race and class and gender, often intersecting in ways that have shown inequalities that have been long rooted and that are now just becoming more exacerbated. So we're asking certain groups of people to put themselves at risk and others can stay at home. And I think we cannot ignore that anymore.
Isn't it ironic that it's in the name of essential? So those people who are on the bus are the ones we deem essential, and they're the ones who get to put themselves at risk.
Then let's pay them the amount of money they deserve to be this essential workforce to make sure we're well fed, right? It's young people at Kohl's. We could go through the details of who these people are, but there is a moment where we need to take a step back and say we need to acknowledge that this exists. I'm curious, Jeff, what you think about this. So one of the things that has been discussed is that AI is the future, automation is the future, that, that a segment of the population, of the workforce, is just going to disappear. That was anticipated. Do you think COVID-19 will make that come quicker?
Well, yeah, I'm not someone who thinks that robots are on the way to destroying sort of jobs, that, to a world without work. But I think what technology does, what it's always done, is it has distributional consequences, sort of. It does create winners and losers. And I think, an episode like this is, potentially will, accelerate the adoption of some types of new technology. And so we'll have sort of a more rapid period of winners and losers being created, sort of, than if technology was sort of going along, in its usual sort of way. Instead, we're going to have this, blip up in the adoption of technology. And so it's a really important part of the story of government policy, I think, of what they'll need to do to respond to, the economic consequences of COVID, that we're very likely to see a concentrated period of what economists would call structural change, sort of, due to,
go ahead. But the big structural change when industrialization came led to a term we now call the Luddites. At that point in time, we didn't look at the Luddites as we do now, because now we've become a very industrialized society. At that time, it was a progressive social movement trying to make sure that the capitalists don't destroy society. Now, we said winners and losers. What if the losers say we're not going to take it anymore? And in some sense, Jen, you were referring to that we're in this era of Black Lives Matter. We're just living in the shadow of the very tragic incident, George Floyd. And look, it may have just happened in the US, but it has touched a chord across the entire world.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think it's true that you're seeing frustration, and I think we're seeing it particularly sharply because there's a sense that it might be heard at this moment. And crisis in the form of COVID might have prepared the ground a bit. People's experience of sacrifice and difficulty might have made them willing to take more risk to be heard at this time. So it's certainly possible that there could be that degree of frustration. To be honest, I'm not sure that I foresee as extreme a response in Australia as I do somewhere like the US. And I would attribute it largely to the economic policies and the economic care that Australia has taken, and citizens' willingness to be in it together. That's been a slogan around the world. But I feel that there are many places, and there are many places where it hasn't necessarily been embraced or really truly acted on. Here, I think there was much more of a, government policies were created that would support people. I think neighbors felt a sense of looking out for one another. In my neighborhood, somebody put little notes in everybody's mailbox and started a Facebook group so that we could look out for older neighbors and people who might need help and might need support. So from the macro level to the very, very micro level, I think you've seen a collective action and a collective spirit that, if anything, can help carry us through that would be it. But I agree with Leah's cautions, and I think, once again, I'll come back to this notion of intentionality, that if we operate by default, which I think it's very human to do, then it would be quite easy to fall into patterns of letting inequalities fester, and I think those frustrations could then amplify. But if we're very intentional, we might.
The question is, do we as a nation have an opportunity to lead? You know, the world is looking for new models. We are absolutely at the cutting edge in terms of getting on top of the first wave. I'm careful using the word first wave because you never know what the future holds. But certainly, if there was, you know, an Olympics of this at the moment, we'd be on the medal table. But is there an opportunity for us to now show that beyond just the public health, in the way we come back to business, in the way we reorganize as a society, in the way we value people that we call essential workers, but then pay them the lowest wage in society? What are our options to lead?
It's interesting because the New York Times actually ran an article about what Australia has done with exactly this argument, that Australia is leading the world in their policies. And they were asking this exact question: why are they leading the world? And one of the comments that came through was that the advice that had been given to this government was that in times of crisis, it's not political. You don't do politics, you just do the best policy, right? You pick the policies that are not necessarily aligned with your own political party, but you make the best policy at that moment in time, whether it comes from the left, the right, the center, from Mars, it doesn't matter. I think the challenge now is, because we've been successful, right, that there is a movement back to the tribal politics. So why is it that at this moment in time, when Jeff is saying, Jeff, I love you, you're saying we need to throw out lifelines, right? The stimulus needs to continue. Why are we ending JobKeepers? Why are we ending free childcare? We know that women are disproportionately burdened. We know that they're going to be knocked out because in ways that are unparalleled. We know that even in the industries in which they occupy, they're being knocked out because they are the lower wage workers. Why is the government now realigning along political ideology and throwing lifelines to construction and manufacturing, but not throwing lifelines to things like childcare or JobKeepers? And this is where I think, if we're leading right now, there is a pivot point where this government could shift from being the world leader back into tribal politics with very serious consequences for certain groups and demographics within the Australian population. And this is a critical
look,
moment.
I'm not trying to defend the government. It was nice if, you know, a minister was here to answer your question. But this is what they might say. And I think, to give them their fair due, they would say, we have borrowed from tomorrow's generations to save your problems today. So we need to keep that borrowing in limit, not in any way to be punitive to someone. It is to protect that the future generations don't have debt burdens, which will limit their health care, their child care, and their school care.
Can I intervene? Sorry.
Yes. No, you respond to the government, not to me. I'm not the one who's making rules.
Dear government, the challenge, however, is that actually when you look at who's disproportionately burdened, it is young people, right? So we're saying we're borrowing from your future generation, right? But why don't we ensure that this generation is actually building wealth? This generation has secure employment. So if the idea, and use some of those resources to ensure that we're shoring up not just others, but also young people at this moment in time. The challenge will be is if we keep things as they are. We already know that young people, women, we'll take young people as an example, right? Because we're talking about their futures, have difficulty accessing full-time secure employment, are in this gig economy. If the idea, then use some of the money from the future to make sure these young people have the wealth that they need, the security that they need, so that when they have to pay it back, that at least they have the jobs that will allow them to do that, afford them to do that, and we have a more thriving society. My concern is that we're going to go back to the way in which we were, and we're going to say, we're only funneling money into certain industries, or there are only certain winners and losers in this, and we're going to lose kind of what we've done, which has been an equalizing moment.
Yes, it has been a great equalizing moment, albeit borrowed from the future. borrowed significantly at a rate and pace we've never done. And I think this is something we will now find out how it plays over the many, many years to come. Jeff, on the issue of borrowing, we borrowed a lot of money to reduce pain in the last 3 to 6 months. What impact will it have on our future?
Well, yeah, I am of the view that we should really focus on the now. To come to the question you asked before as well about, do we have this moment where we can show the world sort of like the way ahead? Well, I think we shouldn't get too far ahead of ourselves, because to go back to what I said right at the start, we've done very, very well. I agree with what everyone's saying about that, but we still have a significant way to go with economic recovery. And I think what we need to do is keep doing what Leah described, which is thinking incrementally about the problems we have with the economy and thinking what the best policies are to solve those problems, rather than starting to think grand plans about, we're going to reform the industrial relations system.
All
we're
right,
going to do
good.
this and
Thank you
that.
for bringing us back.
We need to just worry about the problems we've got at the moment. The thing is that the cost of unemployment, the cost of people losing their jobs now, they're concentrated. They're focused on particular people. The borrowing we do, that's repaid over a long period of time, spread across many people, sort of. So to me, I would put much more weight on borrowing more to reduce the costs now, to get the economy up and running again. Because, of course there's costs in the future, but those are spread out over time and across the population. Whereas the costs of a downturn are very concentrated.
At the moment. All right, we got that message. What history has taught us is that whenever these big, world-changing events happen, usually there have been wars, they leave behind a lot of destruction and tragedy, but good does come out of them. And if you look back, the things we take for granted now, things like public health, social security, all of them came out through periods of great hardship. So, as we look forward from this period of great hardship, and Jeff, I'm not saying it's over, but from this period of hardship, what is the good that could come out of it? So, what could be the silver lining? What could be the lasting legacy? What could be the new programs that 30 years from now people will look back and say, you know what? Oh yeah, they had that COVID thing, and after COVID, look, the world got X, and X has been so good. So perhaps I could start with you, Jen. What good will come out of this?
Well, the primary thing that I've seen that I think is really positive is that, like so many traumatic, difficult experiences, this one has prompted people to look at purpose and meaning and why we do the things that we do. And I think they've reassessed their connections with others and how they wanted to spend their time, and what, since I speak to the workplace, what work meant to them and what role they wanted it to have in their lives, as opposed to simply letting it take over and be their life. Now, not everybody, I want to acknowledge, has had the luxury of spending a lot of time thinking about this, but I do think even in the front lines, maybe especially in the front lines, there's been reason to confront, what am I doing this for? What's the purpose? I think that if we can hold on to that sense of thinking about purpose and thinking about meaning, that could be a foundation that could really serve us well.
That's a wonderful thought. So it's been a period of sort of global self-reflection.
Exactly.
It's on almost an enforced retreat. Yeah. Everyone's had to take time, face themselves, and hopefully this will make us better in some ways. All right, that's a good thought. Leah?
Okay, I'm like a little bit less hopeful, which is hard for me because I'm an American and we are always hopeful. But so I think this is a pivotal moment. If we can actually make good decisions at this point in time, I am hopeful. If we don't, I think we will erase 50 years of progress around gender equality, full stop. I am hopeful that this will be a moment in which we see care, and I don't mean just children, I mean care of parents, care of partners, care, because the care crisis is here and the care crisis is coming with the baby boomers aging, et cetera, et cetera. I could go into this for an hour, but I won't. But we need to acknowledge that care is essential, it's economically important, it knocks people out of the labor market, and the burden is so great that people can't do it alone. So
that's a very good thought. So reflection, care, And be fair to point out, we are one of the world's leading nations to develop this NDIS system, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Now, there are various views on whether it's right or not, but the bottom line is we took a step, and you're saying a much broader concept of care. All right, Jane?
I think that this pandemic has given us the opportunity to see just how vulnerable life actually is, and how much of it hangs by a thread, actually. But that we faced that challenge really remarkably well as a country, and that we've been able to come through it, albeit only part way, in very good shape. And that should give us enormous hope. You know, every generation has their challenge, and this has been ours to date. And I think it sets us up well for future challenges, that we're able to respond very effectively as a community, as a nation, and I think that is probably the most hopeful thing you could have, and you know, a country to live in that has done this.
I must say that immediately after the bushfires, I wasn't feeling like that. But I think you're right in pointing out now one does, and that sense of resilient confidence is it would be a wonderful thing if we sustained that. Jeff,
I think what would be a really nice silver lining would be an increase in trust in public institutions and government. I think, you know, we've had a sustained period of people questioning sort of what you can achieve through politics, questioning sort of the direction, motivation of politics. I think, as everyone's, you know, really highlighted, this episode has shown that government can, you know, achieve for the good. It's never going to be perfect, sort of, especially when you're operating in such a difficult environment. But Australia has done remarkably well.
Yes,
you know, obviously, unfortunately, lives lost, people out of work. But when you compare to the predictions that were being made, so I think sort of this is a lesson in what government can achieve, what good policy making can achieve. But I think the caveat is exactly what Leah said before, which is that trust will only be there if we don't if we're not immediately going back to the tribal politics that. We really need to see a continued emphasis on dealing with the problem, sort of making the problem the priority.
Based on evidence. Well, there you go. So global self-reflection, an emphasis of care, resilient confidence in us as a community, trust in our public institutions. And if I had to add something to that, I would say respect for thoughtful experts who acknowledge uncertainty. And I think in that regard, it's been wonderful to have you here as thoughtful experts who acknowledge uncertainty, as you repeatedly pointed out. And with that, it is time to bring this session to a close. So please join me in thanking our experts, and let me thank you for your interest and attention. Now, this was episode 5. We return with episode 6, which will ask the $64 million, or perhaps I should say the $64 trillion question: what can we do now to prevent a future pandemic? As ever, we are looking for your questions, which help us shape the next episode. We encourage you to share your ideas and questions on the University of Melbourne's social media channels, the details of which are on your screen now. And we will try to address your questions in our next episode with expertise and with evidence. So till next time, thank you for joining us.